I think we're going to try to get started soon. In honor of those of you who got here in a timely fashion. I think some other people will be rolling in as we go. My name is David Harris. I'm with the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute for Race and Justice here at the law school. On behalf of Dean Manning and Professor Brian Nagin, I want to welcome you to Harvard Law School this afternoon. We're really excited about today's program, and I wanted us to get to it as quickly as we can. I wanted to begin by, this is live. So the clicker's not working. Well, anyway, I'll say I wanted to begin by giving a shout and a thanks to the folks from the Fair Punishment Project. I don't know if they're here yet, but Jake Sussman, Rob Smith, Henderson Hill was here earlier, Ron Sullivan, are partners in today's event. And today's event represents a real special day for us to be able to kind of present some work on community justice in conjunction with work that's going on with the Fair Punishment Project. So I'm going to ask my technician a quick question, which is how I can advance these slides. Because I just keep getting noise. Okay. So again, this is a site for the Fair Punishment Project that I just wanted to share with you. You can get to it from our website directly. I encourage you to go and take a look at it. They're really doing some amazing work across the country, and we're pleased to be part of it. So at this time, most of our presentations, I give a shout to Ernest Owens, who helps us through these things. And as many of you may know, Ernest has left us. He's kind of deserted us, abandoned us for North Carolina and a wedding in a couple of days. And although we're glad for his happiness, we really lament his loss. And in fact, the folks at IT and catering have to be lamenting it the most, because when I tried to do his work and put in the orders for these events, I somehow failed. I got a call yesterday at about 3:30 saying, David, you want catering? You want IT? You better put it in. And fortunately, they came through and they got us the catering, and they're here doing the videotaping. So a special thanks to them as well as to events. What Ernest's absence means, however, is that all thanks and praise really goes to Kelly Garvin, who has stepped up and done the work that Ernest used to do, in addition to the work that she does, including designing our poster. So it's usually my custom to give a brief introduction and then jump off the stage and flee the podium. But today I'm going to linger a little bit. As I said, it's a special day. It comes nearly a year after, a year after we did a major conference here called Living in the Carceral State. Some of you might have been here for that, and it was really an incredible event that filled the law school with activists from across the Commonwealth. Today, we make the long-awaited launch of our community justice work. Many of you have heard me speak and heard us speak, have heard this phrase for several years. And we started back in 2012 with the ill-fated attempt to create a 3 strikes legislation here. And we were struck by the deep chasm between those who voted for the legislation and those who were going to be affected by it. That's when we determined to advance the concept of community justice. By this we mean the amplification of the voices of those most affected by policies in discussions about those policies and investment priorities. Our next step came last year when we launched our new website, anchoring the Houston Marshall Plan for Community Justice. We call today's event Justice Works, and the wordplay is intended. We hope to show that there's an alternative to the common notion of criminal justice, a phrase I hope to banish from our vocabulary forever. I apologize to those of you who've heard this rant in the past, but I firmly believe that one of the most important steps toward changing our public policy framework is erasing the association between criminality and justice. We certainly have something very specific in mind at the Institute when we use the term justice. For us, community justice means being made whole. It means repairing the damage wrought by the war on drugs and the war on crime to our communities, and especially to communities of color. This evening, we share some examples of how we can create pathways within instead of outside of communities, blazed by those living in these communities that lead to a justice that works. They are works of justice that work. As Jasmine will discuss shortly, we began this effort with what we call community justice activism, identified on our website as Community Justice Acts. For many years, excuse me, there have been calls from various public officials for the adoption of some sort of Marshall Plan and to rebuild our cities. If you visit our website, you'll see a timeline listing just a few of these. Indeed, shortly before he left office, President Obama said, theoretically, you can make powerful argument that centuries of slavery, Jim Crow discrimination, were wrongs of black community as a whole and black communities specifically. And that in order to close that gap, the society has a moral obligation to make a large, aggressive investment, even if it's not in the form of individual reparation checks, but in the form of a Marshall Plan. Those of you who were here yesterday for the symposium honoring our founder, Professor Charles Ogletree, will recognize his influence on the president. 20 years ago, Professor Ogletree framed the call for reparations in precisely this language of a moral obligation. Our vision of the Houston Marshall Plan, drawing from both Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall, for content and guidance at once mirrors and departs from the original following World War II, and the frequent calls for a Marshall Plan that followed. We recall that the original Marshall Plan was not a single blueprint, as we might imagine, for rebuilding Europe, but consisted of 37,000 pages, documents, 37,000 pages. In today's internet age, that would be quite a sight. Such volume was necessary because the rebuilding was local, and it was an aspect that it's this aspect that we hope to replicate. The underlying premise of the Houston Marshall Plan is that our communities contain within them lived experience, understanding, and knowledge about both strengths and weaknesses, and about solutions that directly address what's not currently working. Not only are these solutions local, but they're grounded in community justice. The plan does not envision massive federal expenditures or intervention, but rather seeks to identify and influence the levers of local government and policymaking. And it is modern. As a modern variation, it lives on the website. Now, I'm not going to go into it, but I invite you to visit the website by either going to charleshamiltonhouston.org or houstonmarshallplan.org. Here you'll find research and resources focused on 8 dimensions along which we must rebuild. You see them at the top here, listed at the top. The latter, one thing I'll note is that when we talk about safety and healing, that's what other people talk about criminal justice, and that's one of the ways that we hope to change the language. Our idea here draws directly from Charles Hamilton Houston, who famously and wisely warned, even as he proceeded to craft a legal strategy that would be the demise of state-sanctioned school segregation, that we could not rest with that victory, but must make all of our struggles tie in together. In addition to the research and resources, however, the website features community justice acts I mentioned earlier. Here we highlight activities from across the country working in all 8 dimensions. This covers not only a spectrum of different activities and topics, but a range from efforts of single individuals to those of large institutional organizations, and we'll have examples of both of those today. Today's event is designed to be an introduction to these works, including the works of the Institute. It's important to emphasize that although some of today's examples address reform of the law enforcement system, we record efforts on the site in all the other realms. Perhaps more important is our goal to use various points of entry to a new way of thinking about public policy that recognizes the interconnections across otherwise siloed policy realms. I want us to get to the program and now turn to a little background on our panelists. Before doing so, I must emphasize how we operate. With Ernest's departure, we are down to a staff of 3. Johanna Wald, Kelly Garden, who I mentioned, and me. We are extremely fortunate, however, to have incredible help along the way from students, fellows, friends, and volunteers. Today's event includes two of our most faithful and fruitful associates, Jasmine Gomez and Lillie Estes, from whom you'll hear. Those of you who were at the Carceral State Conference remember Jasmine as a powerful, effective, and genuine voice, so don't be getting all shy, of justice. She is, in many respects, the conscience of our project, always holding us to our mission of making sure we use our perch to elevate the voices of those we claim to serve. You'll hear more from her, but we were blessed to have her work with us all of last year and provide the real foundation for community justice activism. Aramis Ayala, I can never say that, was elected state attorney from the 9th District in Florida in November, on that fateful day, I should say, November 8th, 2016. For many despairing the election results that night, the one bright spot was the triumph of a slate of reform-minded prosecutors, including Aramis, in states as varied as Florida, Colorado, Texas, Alabama. She gained national attention for her principled stand against the death penalty and the efforts of public officials in Florida to take away the discretion offered to other prosecutors in the state. Today, though, we hope to highlight a different side of her, as one who practices community justice. As we think about dismantling mass incarceration, we often look to a growing cohort of progressive prosecutors determined to forge new relationships with communities they serve and more enlightened approaches to public safety. Indeed, as she said during her campaign, quote, "There is no contradiction in supporting law enforcement while also saying there are serious issues with the relationship between police and some of the communities they serve." So we really look forward to hearing from her about her priorities and approach to public safety and how these fit within the community justice framework. Katherine Stanton is one of several, is one of several remarkable young people who joined us this past summer. These interns from Amherst, Yale, Stanford, Brown, Barnard, as well as Beaver Country Day School and Tappan Zee High School, formed a special community of their own this summer and really catapulted us, so here we are, their leisurely poses, to where we are today. They worked to create community justice act, document community justice acts across the country, shoot videos of local efforts, created podcasts with local faculty on the meaning of justice, and help us think through a plan for social media strategy for rolling out our project. Sadly, they deserted us to return to their academic pursuits, but before leaving, they designed a Medium page we will launch called Internal Affairs. This will be the home to ongoing work in the area, including blogs on what they are doing, but also a home for future interns. So today, Katherine stands in for her entire cohort as she presents some of the work they did. Kate Gonzalez is the political director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. Kate has been doing political and community-based advocacy for many years with various organizations and constituencies, with a consistent theme of addressing and eliminating inequality in our justice system. She was a driving force behind a remarkable document, Disrupting Mass Incarceration at the Local Level, which struck me at first sight as a profound example of organizational community justice activism. As Katherine will attest, the first time I saw the report this summer, I was determined to bring her to share it with us. It's hard for me to believe we've been able to make it happen, and give a special thanks to the Fair Punishment Project for helping make it so. Lillie Estes is the heart and soul of Richmond, Virginia. Take my word. And one of our oldest allies. She embodies the very essence of community justice. A self-described community strategist, Lillie has been organizing tirelessly and against great odds for decades. She has adapted rather than adopted the notion of community justice as appropriate in Richmond, home of the Confederacy, and truly the front line to the need for community justice. With virtually no financial support, but in partnership with others in Richmond, she has created and conducted a community justice film series which stands at one end of the spectrum I mentioned earlier, a project begun and initiated by an individual. We're really pleased to have her here to describe her work and share in conversation about the challenges of community justice. So before we begin with our first speaker, I wanted to play a video that was done by the interns. I'm sorry, this was the last work that Ernest Owens did for us, which was a film he made on his iPhone and represents the beginning of the work that we call community justice activism.
I'm from Colombia. I'm a journalist, and I was doing a Master in Media Innovation at Northeastern University. East Boston is my neighborhood. This is where I live. I live here in Bennington Street. I've been living here for 6 months, and it's my community. East Boston Nuestra Casa. This series of postcards is a project that I did to inform Latinos about the resources that are available on the neighborhood to fight displacement. And this is a project that can be done by anyone. This is easy to do. Like, I uploaded the file, I uploaded the design of these postcards online, so you just have to download that, change the photo, change the text, and then you can have your own project in your neighborhood with the needs of your neighborhood. This was the first photo I took of all the project, and these are Marta and Ruth. And this is Marta's partner, and this is a guy who was just saying hi. I was here because they have been facing displacement for 2 years. They got the eviction notice on 2015, and they've been back and forth negotiating with the landlords. Marta and Ruth and Margarita, who are 3 different women in 3 different units of the building, got support from City Life and from the harbor lawyers. And it became so expensive for the landlords to maintain that process, that legal process on court, that they decided to do something, to negotiate. So 1 month ago, what happened was the biggest victory of tenants here in East Boston. They got a definite lease, formal lease, and with small increases in rent every year. So it's amazing because of that, because of the help of those harbor lawyers, they got to stay in their home. And now they have place here that they've been calling home for years. They've been here for more than 10 years, and they don't have to rush away and move to another neighborhood. So this case is one of the cases that inspired this project. And it could look like what's happening in just 2 buildings away. Like, this could have been renovated, and they were not being here. So this is a project that was done by me, but it's also something that can be done by anyone, and it needs a community to be done. So even though I was like the one who leaded it, I needed people to open me the doors of their home, to talk to me, to tell me their stories, and doing that you create a transformation. You empower people, you make people feel heard, and you just create that conversation that is very necessary to know the testimony of those who are being abused, and that can also know their rights, and when knowing their rights, they want to help others. So this is a project that puts that information out there and creates community.
So, thank you. And with that, I want to bring up, so I just want to emphasize that was something that this young man did. Whoops. Thank you, Jasmine. Where did I get that? So, come on, get that off of there. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Harris from the Mass Institute, and on behalf of Dean Minnow, that was low. I'm sorry. That was pretty good, though. That's a pretty fun. All right. So, So again, just to emphasize that this was a project that this young man did on his own and started on his own, and it was shot on an iPhone, and it's the kind of thing that we actually hope to be able to do a lot more of. Having said that, I want to turn now to our first speaker, who can talk to us a little bit about her work and experience in several realms of justice. And I want to say, just as we're so pleased to have had all of our other guests, we're especially pleased that you were able to carve out the time to join us today. Aramis, Ayala.
Hello, everyone. Hello. So there's a few things that I want to talk about. You know, he mentioned that I ran for office, that I became a state attorney down in Florida, which is now my current position. But the reason that what I do is relevant here today is because one of the platforms that I ran on was community prosecution and community outreach. And when I decided to run for office, community engagement was necessary for me to get votes. It was extremely important for me to go through this process and for everyone to get to know me and hopefully be familiar with my name, raise my profile, because it was all about me. The one thing that I learned while I was trying to get everyone to know me was that I needed to get to know them. How could I say that I'm a state attorney, a prosecutor for the people, I'm looking to serve them, but I just want them to know me? It has to be a reciprocal relationship. So I started engaging and trying to get them to tell me what their fears were, what their experiences were, because one of the things that we think about when it comes to crime is we think about the defendants, right? We think about their involvement in the system, and we want to make certain that they're well protected. But when you look at the statistics of the crime in the communities, it's actually on those who live there as well. So when you look at the race and the makeup of the defendant, it also is representative of that of the victim. So I wanted to make certain that I understood the voice of the victims, because they want their community safe. And once I won the election, I had to remember they're still just as important, right? So this isn't something that I only need them every 4 years. I need them in order to properly serve them the entire time that I'm in office. When a politician wants the people's vote, they also have to want to genuinely serve them. And that was a commitment that I made. I need to constantly be involved, not because it's about me, because service is really about them. The reason that we want the engagement during the election process is because we need their vote. Well, they need us, and they're making this determination who's going to best serve my needs in my community and keep my area safe. Who's going to do that? And if I made those promises, I need to deliver on them. And I can't deliver on them if I'm not putting attorneys and myself down in the community with them. So I created a community outreach division. And what that involves is us being involved in community events. And one of the things that we'll be rolling out January 1st of next year is community education. A lot of times people don't understand the process. They don't understand what is actually going on and what their part is. And what happens is they've been a witness of crime, or they've been a victim of crime, and they end up being used for the process and then thrown away afterward. It is my goal to make certain that you are valued throughout the process and that you know that you are well cared for, and we want to keep your community safe as well. So making certain that we are present at the events, making certain that when you invite us, we are present, we're listening to you, and most importantly, as I said, we're educating you so that you know where your frustrations need to lie, right? So one of the issues right now in a lot of communities, especially in communities of color, are police shootings. And I constantly, every community event I go to, what happens? Well, what can you do about this? Or the police are shooting us, what can you do? And I have to now explain to them that my hands are somewhat tied because we don't police the police. We have an opportunity to investigate, but there are limitations. So what happens is now they understand that this is the process of how the legislature has set it up, and their involvement in legislative process, their involvement in legislative elections becomes much more important of how they're going to engage and what their legislator is going to represent in our capital when they start looking at the laws that allow police officers to be held accountable. So now, instead of being mad at the prosecutor, instead of even being mad at the law enforcement officer because, quite frankly, in a lot of situations, he's following policy. Our problem is with the policy and that they have a lot of leeway to do certain things. So what we need to do is make certain that they are educated about the process. And that's what community prosecution and community engagement does. It lets you know where the holes are, and it gets you truly representing the community that you say you served. Now, my process of engagement has been from the beginning, and the one thing that I make certain that all the attorneys in my office do is understand that we aren't just about convicting. Now, if you commit a heinous crime and you need to serve time, that is what you do, but our job is so much wider than that. We have a responsibility to the community, and part of being a part of the community and being responsible is engaging with them and advising them and staying connected with them. Otherwise, we're lording over them, and that's what happens with the imbalances of power when we want to tell the community what they need versus going and listening to what they need so that we can best serve them. It's no different than you going to, or a server or someone coming into your home telling you what colors your home needs to be, what type of window treatments you need in your home. You know where the lighting comes in, you know where the sun comes up, you know where the toilet flushes and how the sound impacts you in which room. So you're now telling them, and they can help you get the best of what you need. That's exactly what community engagement is when you truly are interested. But the truth is, it takes a level of humanity and a genuine spirit to serve. It cannot be about the person in service. So when I am doing all that I'm doing to serve the community, it's because I really care. I'm going to close on this one point. What I stand on, and I said this earlier when I spoke, when I ran for office, I made one promise. I would make no decisions or take no actions for re-election. If it was right for me to promise it to the people, then it's right for me to continue to do, unless there's some type of bearing that I have to overcome, and then it's my responsibility to advise everyone why I was unable to keep that promise. But when you have people in power who are committed to the people, then that means the people have to be committed to speak. They have to be committed to advise what it is that they need, and then flow very smoothly so those in power and those who those in power are serving can work together and ultimately have the common ground and the common goal of public safety. So I look forward to the discussion tonight, but again, I think it's very important that if you're going to start off asking for the public to support you, the only job that you have once you get in office is to continue to support them. So I look forward to it. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me?
Okay, cool.
Hey everybody, my name is Jasmine Gomez and I have previously worked at the Houston Institute. Currently I'm an activist and an attorney in the Boston area, and I'm really excited to be here. Part of what I'm going to talk to you about is while I was working at the Houston Institute for Race and Justice, we helped create a series of community justice events at Roxbury Community College. So we hosted these events so that we could consider what organizations are supposed to do in order to listen to, learn from, engage, and empower their community members. We also wanted to check in with local community to make sure that we were being held accountable and we were actually, committing to the work that they want us to commit to. So as David mentioned earlier, we understand that community justice can be applied much more broadly than these events. And in fact, there's a lot of grassroots organizations in Boston and around the country that automatically include that framework into the work that they do. But we also want to know that community justice can and should be applied to a wide range of things, including individuals and how they interact with people, to policy-making decisions, and they should include all sorts of topic areas as well. So this event here that we're at right now is about exploring the different approaches to community justice, and this is just one of the many, many approaches that exist. So these community justice events brought together community members affected by structural racism in Roxbury, professionals, and students from the city. We got together in a large group setting, and community members shared their experiences and really opened their hearts. Everyone learned from the community about some of the oppression and issues that folks living in Roxbury experience. Some of the issues that people talked about was the cost of education, violence in the community, transportation, the systems of mass incarceration, mentorship, empowering youth to be able to do social activism, mental health, food security, bigotry, and DAs and other people of power, addiction, homelessness, police brutality, the miseducation of Black youth and youth of color. There's so much insight. It was really powerful. You could really feel the energy in the room. And so people got into smaller group circles after this big group discussion, and they talked about potential solutions for these issues, as well as highlighting programs and organizations that already exist in the Boston area or around the country. We learned a lot. We learned about accountability, trust, access and opportunity for affected people, restoration and healing, the importance of listening, and so much more. From these events, there's some themes that I wanted to highlight as extremely valuable for anybody engaging in community justice, especially in an event form kind of moving forward, and I just wanted to talk about those a little. The first, very important, most important, is that we have to take an asset-based approach towards our community. So people in the community have valuable information and insight. That's why we do the work that we do. And community justice is about gaining that insight and listening and understanding the perspectives from the community. We also want to be aware of power dynamics in certain situations. For example, understand what it means to have politicians, police officers, prosecutors in a space with communities that are largely affected by systems of mass incarceration. Think about how do we build trust and how do we create safe spaces. To building trust, I found that it was really helpful for us to work with local organizations that were respected in the community. And that could be grassroots organizations, but it could also be public schools. It could be community centers, churches, temples, mosques, and in our case was the Roxbury Community College. Also, it's really important to create a safe space that will give everybody a voice. It's going to actually reach the community. So that means we don't want hierarchy in the systems, in the spaces when we're trying to listen to our community members. We want maybe circle processes, food, poetry, music. How do we connect? How do we engage on a human, individual, one-on-one level? We also want to provide resources and access for people. Know that many low-income communities and communities of color often don't have the resources or time to devote to a multi-hour event. Give stipends for laborers if possible. Find ways to make sure that people in the community have the resources they need to participate in community justice. And of course, listen more than you talk. Again, it's about what you gain from the community. And so with that being said, I just wanted to end with a video from the event that I thought was really powerful and highlighted just some of the...
of course, there's mass incarceration, there's affordable housing.
So slow down.
Sorry. There's a lot of passion in there.
I have a class, I gotta go.
Access, opportunity, and justice, sorry.
Gentrification, affordable housing, justice, we got that health, charter schools. And I also think bigotry is huge, you know what I mean? Because the people that are in position that make the decisions, so we're talking about DAs, POs, prosecutors, parole board members, power structure. We're talking about self-advocacy. We're talking about profit, administration, capitalistic society.
Can you submit that to us in writing?
That's why you're peppering on it.
Yeah. I'm serious though. So let's come back to that. But, I mean, Sam, don't worry about
The main one that I feel is the most important is finding common ground. Because like I said earlier, we're all one race, and God forbid there's something else out there that we got to compete against one day, or something bad happens, and we all have to come together. So I think finding common ground is a major key.
So let me ask you guys. So as you did it, did you have any ideas about how to do that?
Yes, actually one idea that was brought up was that, in regards to administration in schools, there should be a screening process. I feel like, the community should be involved, parents should be involved, because these are people that actually face the struggle every day. And you have people in positions of power, in prominent positions, that don't understand the struggle because they never had to deal with it. So, I mean, I think that, you know, more community engagement is ideal, would be ideal.
The keyword is accountability.
Yeah, accountability. Right.
In that process.
Lillie did the photos and the video, so I just want to do a shout out. So that's just a little bit of our events. I'm going to pass it over now.
Hi everyone, my name is Katherine Stanton and I was an intern this past summer. Along with my two co-interns, Toluade Sagade and Samantha O'Brien, we were doing research into district attorney elections, and we'd like to give a special thanks to consultant and friend of the Institute, Nancy McCardle. So this work extends the work of the Houston Institute and the Criminal Justice Institute around prosecutorial reform. And most recently, the Fair Punishment Project reported on misconduct in 4 states across the country. And so insofar as the Fair Punishment Project is working at a broad level to research and report on misconduct, we want to think about how we could create a toolkit for more local engagement. And we were really inspired by Kate's work, as David said. And currently there's a lot of silence around district attorney elections and misconduct. Oftentimes incumbent candidates run unopposed. There's lack of avenues for dialogues with candidates as well as district attorneys once they're in office. There's a lack of media coverage, which contributes to low rates overall in the election, low rates of voter participation. And there's a lack of transparency in misconduct issues. So clearly, given the huge power that prosecutors wield in the carceral systems, this is an issue around which mobilization is incredibly important. And given the premise of community justice, that elected officials should be held accountable to the communities most impacted by prosecutorial decisions, we want to think about ways in which someone could engage in this process. This means that within America, Black communities are oftentimes the most over-policed and the most over-incarcerated. And so voting engagement is just one aspect of this. Things such as candidate questionnaires, community forums, tools for tracking misconduct, and support for potential candidates to run in district attorney races are all very important. And there are many reasons that people don't vote. There are oftentimes barriers such as voter identification laws, difficulty in transportation to the polls, as well as the fact that historically elected officials are often not accountable to the communities which they're supposed to be serving. Even given that our entry point was voting, because it is one way in which community voices can be heard within the district attorneys, especially those communities that are so affected by the choices of prosecutors. So we analyzed publicly available voting data to understand participation trends within the San Diego County gubernatorial general election. So here you can see screenshots from documents that we received from the San Diego County Registrar of Voters, who we worked closely with throughout this process. So we gathered data and we went consolidated precinct by consolidated precinct within the city of San Diego, because that is the most populous. And so we were tracking, our specific data point was blank votes, which is when someone participates in the votes for a governor, but for whatever reason, oftentimes misinformation or lack of awareness, they don't vote for a DA. And that is quite common in offices throughout the country. So here you can see we were tracking all this on spreadsheets. And we eventually gave it to our consultant friend, Nancy, who did a series of preliminary maps. And she was able to combine our information with demographic information. So on the left here, you can see that this map shows areas of blank district attorney votes. The areas that are darkest are the areas with the highest number of votes, meaning blank votes, meaning that someone voted for a governor but didn't vote for the district attorney. Here is areas of the highest number of registered voters. Areas that are darker are areas with more registered voters. And then here on the left, this is in the green, that's the difference between the number of registered voters and the number of DA votes. So you can see that the areas that are darker, that means that there are actually quite a few people registered to vote there already, but they're not voting for the district attorney. And then here on the right is areas of black voting age population within San Diego. The areas that are darker have higher numbers of individuals who are black and of voting age and who could potentially be engaged in the election. So given our analysis of the data and the maps, we came to the conclusion that the majority of the people who voted for governor also voted for DA. So within certain communities, the issue is not specifically a lack of awareness of the importance of the DA. However, as a percentage of registered voters, there is very few people voting for DA. Only 25% of people who are registered to vote actually voted for the district attorney. So that means that we were thinking that a specific strategy someone could use in the San Diego City community would be to focus on educational efforts among those already registered to vote, as well as registering voters in communities of color. So we produced Nancy produced two maps given this. On the left is the areas that are yellow are black groups based on census data with a large black voting age population. And then the areas outlined in blue are precincts with low numbers of registered voters. So if you wanted to register voters of color, this would help you determine where your efforts might be most effective. And then on the right is the areas in yellow are block groups with large black voting age populations and a precincts with large difference between registered voters and DA votes, which means that in those areas that are both encircled in red and also yellow, there are a lot of community members of color who are registered to vote but not participating in the DA election. So educational efforts there, if you are strapped for time and resources, would be more effective. But there are some limitations to these maps they were making, which just demonstrate the overall issues within the incarceration system that need to be addressed. So the areas that are in blue, which are those areas with the lowest number of registered voters, those could be blue because there's just a low population density in those areas. Further, the goal with this map is to identify areas with a large difference between the number of eligible voters who could be registered to vote and those who are currently registered. So, however, calculating that difference requires subtracting and dividing different types of boundaries with our map. But also to emphasize that when you have the areas in yellow, which is black voting age population, that doesn't take into consideration many of people who are disenfranchised as a result of incarceration. So that makes mapping that much more difficult, but that also demonstrates how that's another entry point for organizing around helping people coming back who are incarcerated into like broader structural changes allowing them to vote. So engaging in this type of analysis is useful not only to think about how you could perhaps maybe change election outcomes, but how this provides an entry point into other issues affecting the democratic system as well. So further research is needed to address both of those issues. And the Houston Institute is building a toolkit, so that will include methods for how to collect this data and do the type of mapping that Nancy was helping us with, as well as information on the power of the DA, resources for researching prosecutorial misconduct, sample candidate questionnaires, and a guide for holding a public forum. And this tool is only as good as it is useful. So this will be developed in with trying to listen to what specific communities need. So really the real change will occur through partnering with local organizations who can best identify what the situation is in their own community. And the ACLU Campaign for Smart Justice is currently engaging in a lot of work around prosecutors. They have recently gone into Philadelphia and trained canvassers, many of whom were formerly incarcerated, to canvass for nonpartisan voter education. So the Houston Institute looks forward to working with other efforts such as this. In conclusion, the voting engagement process needs to be more accessible through providing financial resources to organizers interested in the issue of the DA, as well as technological support, because GIS is a very powerful tool, but it yet remains out of the reach of many people, including myself. So there needs to be a way to make that more easier to use. So yes, overall it will have to be a broad strategy for community justice. Thank you.
Oof, it worked. I'm always a little nervous using someone else's computer. So, again, my name's Kate Gonzalez. I'm the political director at the Oregon Justice Resource Center. We are a nonprofit public interest law firm in Oregon. We represent currently incarcerated and formerly incarcerated Oregonians, in addition to advocating for broader justice reform. So I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all the experience we have in the room and to say what an extreme honor it is to be here today. David mentioned calling me about my report, but what he doesn't know is that for me, seeing Harvard on the call screen, I went around the office the rest of the day. I was like, Harvard was calling. And so it's such an honor to be here, especially the more I learn about the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute and the work you're doing here. I feel like this work is more important than ever during these times. And so I hope you all take some time to engage with the center. So I really love all the panelists tonight talking about community building, and so I would just add that I hope after the presentations and the panel, some of you will take some time to stick around afterwards and have cookies and we can talk and really try to build community. So I don't have time to get into all of the different historical reasons why we are where we are today with being the world's jailer, but obviously there are extreme systems of racialized social control that have been perpetuated. And I just want to emphasize that the prison population has quadrupled in my lifetime alone. So this has happened under our watch for everyone in this room. And so I think it's extremely important that we're all here tonight to try to think for new transformational ways to approach these issues, because it's really going to take a movement to dial back and start decarcerating these systems. I think many of us recognize with all the different issue areas that the Institute works on, how interconnected these issues really are. And, you know, for decades now, it's been obvious that we've continued to try to incarcerate our way out of trauma, out of poverty, out of mental illness, out of addiction, out of all these different issues, and it's not working. So we desperately need folks on the ground trying to come up with new solutions, and those are community solutions. And so I want to just touch upon kind of some of the reasons we released this report. Is this is a really exciting moment to be doing these issues, working on these problems with community. I feel like there's a great massive bubbling up of people interested right now in how we change course. And as a result, in my day job, I started getting a pretty heavy stream of calls from interested community members. And, you know, some of them are formerly incarcerated people wanting to advocate for justice reform and use their story. And people were wanting to know what they could do and how they could plug in. And that was very much the genesis of this report, because we really started thinking about this problem with kind of a new approach. And I really challenge everyone in this room. I hope you walk away tonight, if anything at all, with a lens to look at these issues really as local level issues. These impact your communities where you live and already hold power. So, as I mentioned, this is a moment where a lot of people are getting really frustrated, and these systems seem so huge and people feel so powerless. In many ways, people are feeling like they don't have a voice in these systems that have thoroughly brutalized entire communities, sometimes for decades, creating intergenerational systems of diminished futures. And so there's a lot of energy right now, but people don't quite know how to plug in. And you know, I love David's point of moving away from the criminal justice frame, but also another problematic term is the criminal justice system. And really, this is not a system at all. This is a combination of different bureaucracies, agencies, people. Many times they don't work well together. They have different cultures. We assume that there's some sort of coordination, but in many ways there isn't. So there's so many different pathways and personalities, and there's varying levels of discretion and power all embedded in this complex web. So having people try to find entry points into trying to change course can be extremely complicated. When we started asking folks about, yes, I already put this picture up, about you know, what they think about when they think about criminal justice reform or issues related to over-criminalization, a lot of people pointed out two things. They often talked about the president and the current administration's powers around the bully pulpit, or using powers around incentivizing culture change through funding in some ways. But a lot of folks were also really distraught by the use of force incidents that are taking place across this country amongst law enforcement. But I really want to point out and emphasize that in between these 2 points, there are a huge amount of system actors that often people don't associate with criminal justice issues, and they hold immense power to bring about actual culture change in the systems where we live, work, and build community. And so I pulled up this graph from Massachusetts from the Prison Policy Initiative, and I just really want to point out the federal prison population. As you can see, it's really just a small sliver. Also here, the state prisons is another chunk. But look at all of these people. These folks are all under some form of local control. And again, I think that's largely being left off of a lot of people's radar. Local entry points into the system are where people actually hold the keys to the front door of the entire system. So in order for us to dial back some of these extreme inequities we're seeing amongst state prison populations, amongst racial disparities and other inequalities, those didn't just get there overnight. Those originated from a local decision-making and local budgetary decisions and local hiring practices and local culture. So I come from a long line of different types of organizing, and when I first started thinking more critically about criminal justice issues, obviously at the end of the day, this is a discussion about power. Who holds power? And I feel like with this realm, more than any other, there's so much kicking the can that goes on, of people throwing up their hands. And anyone who's dealt with the justice system knows the frustration I'm talking about, where you try to make a phone call and you try to figure out who holds power. So what we did in the guide is we put forth a power mapping framework. And this is not new. It's been used by organizers for decades. Folks at the Ella Baker Center are using it around criminal justice issues. There's many folks using it, but really what it is coming together with other community members and drawing relational grids of power lines to figure out where the buck stops. And so it's doing that community building with others that we end up really changing a lot of these issues. Many people feel powerless sitting at home, but the moment you come together, even if it's just 2 or 3 other people to work on one issue, and you start figuring out who are the decision makers, who are the influencers, it really helps to start really moving towards strategizing on these issues. Again, I mentioned the front entry point into these systems. I think the Vera Institute has been doing interesting work recently lifting up local jail populations. I mean, there are people who are churning through the system at alarming rates, astounding rates, disproportionately impacting people of color, houseless individuals, members of the trans community are disproportionately represented. And so again, in order for us to really start taking a different direction, we need to be cognizant of the way this is a funnel entry point into the system. John Paff has also done some really interesting work recently about how states don't decarcerate, counties decarcerate. So what we have is some counties actually growing their prison populations and others really are dialing it back. And some of this is related to prosecutors and their charging practices. And I think, you know, the previous presentation that Katherine gave is so important because I think undoubtedly at the local level, at the county level, the individual who has more power over the system than anyone else is the district attorney. And many folks aren't aware of the way our justice system operates these days because I'm like a lot of us. I watch TV and I thought everyone had a trial and you had a jury of your peers. Little did I know 90 to 95% of these cases are getting hammered out in plea deals under fluorescent lighting in back rooms. And so there's immense amount of power. And also, this is a picture from Multnomah County where I live, but what does it mean when we have a disproportionate number of these folks who have the most power in the system don't have the same lived experiences as the people that they are sentencing day in, day out, or charging. So in Oregon, in our report, I was really alarmed to find out that it was the major urban centers that were the major drivers behind the prison populations. And this shouldn't have surprised me because these are naturally major population hubs, right? But the ironic thing to me is we have a whole host of elected officials running as progressives, and we have a very strong progressive constituency base that goes even further than a lot of our electeds on criminal justice related issues. So on issues related to rehabilitation and treatment. And so it was just really interesting to me to think that a lot of these really quote unquote blue safe spots for progressives on all these other issues, environment, pro-choice, all these issues, were actually driving major segments of the prison population, to the extent that in the county where I live, Multnomah County, 1 in 5 people in our prisons is actually coming from Multnomah County. And so we may be less punitive than some of the surrounding counties in more rural areas, but the amount of potential we have to transform the system if more folks started regularly contacting their local electeds is just immense. I mean, these are just the 5 major population hubs, account for more than all the 31 others combined, and I'm sure Massachusetts is probably no different. So in the report, we really started lifting up all of these other elected officials because we really feel like there needs to be buy-in amongst all of these electeds to put pressure on each other, in addition to having the bottom-up pressure coming up from communities most impacted, and community organizers and people on the ground level need to also be supported by the electeds who are there to really represent them. But the thing is a lot of these folks weren't regularly hearing from communities associated with progressive justice reform. So, for example, county commissioners are funding some of our district attorney budgets, or school board members, the powers they have to kind of roll back some of the school to prison pipeline and overhaul some of the disciplinary policies, or city commissioners, in Portland, the mayor appoints the police chief, and the police chief has a lot of power in determining culture change practices, and the city commissioners also develop a lot of different ordinances that can end up criminalizing quality of life crimes. So there's all sorts of different ways these folks at the local level really have immense power to start dialing back these systems of over-criminalization. And I really want to point out that a lot of these things that are now crimes didn't used to be. We've become much more punitive as a society, and that's why the over-criminalization piece is so key. There used to be actors outside of the system that sometimes would deal with some of these, especially with broken windows. A lot of these issues were considered nuisances, and now you can be charged in some localities. So this was all really brought home to me when one day I happened to stumble upon a county commissioner hearing, and just the day prior, I had been getting, tons of phone calls that everyone was really upset that some of the local police had been rounding up a lot of protesters. But at this hearing, there was no one. There was no one. Only one individual from the community showed up to testify, and there wasn't anyone from the advocacy organizations. I wasn't there. There was no one from the community speaking out. And so, there was testimony from law enforcement, and then this gentleman got up and said, I don't see why we're going to spend another $500,000 to keep these jail beds open when just recently you rounded up a bunch of my friends who were doing peaceful protest and locked them up. And so it really flipped things for me in terms of, if we have enough beds, we somehow end up filling them. Mm-hmm. And so would these people, would it be seen as a non-essential arrest, and they would have maybe got a citation if we didn't have the bed space for them? And so, but also, this is $500,000. This is money we could have been used towards other forms of prevention outside of the criminal justice system entirely that have much better outcomes in terms of investing in job training and treatment and housing and community support systems. And so, it was a 3-2 vote. And Well, I was really distraught this day that this passed, and we did end up using all this money. I'm happy to say that since that time, our county commissioners really have taken strides to decrease our reliance on jail beds, and so they have continued to close some of the jail dorms, so they are making progress. But to me, it was a real eye-opener because, it's hearings like this that are empty, and it wouldn't have taken much to flood this meeting to have like 5 people. And so for a lot of community members we work with, it can be a tremendous cost for them to go to our state capital. I mean, it's 50 miles away. It requires maybe taking the day off work, and it requires gas money. But a lot of people live in Portland and could make this meeting if they had known about it happening. And so I really realized this is an area where, advocacy organizations are falling down, and that's on me. We need to provide more readily accessible opportunities for people to start engaging with the elected officials that are there to represent them. And I will also say these electeds also need that cover. They need to be able to say, I've been hearing from my constituents that they want this, so that they can go even further. Because, some of the electeds I've spoken with are saying, I tried to put my neck out, and unless we all are supporting forward movement, they can feel like they're a lone voice as well. So, I think there's tremendous power once we realize that for decades, the crime rate has really been plummeting, with the exception of a few peaks and valleys that are also really geographically based. But despite, the crime rate plummeting, we've continued to ratchet up some of these systems of mass criminalization, and that is reified and really mundane everyday decisions of who you're hiring, what budgets you're passing, what new policies you're implementing. And until more of our electeds are held accountable on these issues, it's going to be hard for us to change course. So where we're at with the guide is, this summer we just released it. We're very much open to feedback. We want to hear if this is on target. We want to hear your ideas. We have a section on our website where people can submit ideas. Many community members have already submitted amazing ideas that we had never even considered, or that were totally off our radar. We've been giving several different presentations to different groups, whether that be inside prisons to now Harvard, and everyone in between. And so we're really trying to just raise awareness. The second stage is we're doing a deep dive into research of some of the issues that are starting to bubble up, that people are flagging for us, and in our conversations with community members, trying to see what issues they care about most. And then third, we're really trying to be collaborative and trying to figure out what are some simple campaigns we could launch. And I love this postcard idea. What are things we could do at the local level that give people an easy way to plug in, that it happens in between elections? There's a lot of time, and in between your state legislature meeting, people want to engage right now. There's a lot of energy, so we have to provide opportunities for people to plug in, and we have to do that collaboratively. And so what we're just starting to do is, this is very much a draft, but we're trying to break down some of the budgetary process so that groups can start testifying and using their voice more readily to get plugged in with this process. As I've been diving into this more, it's been interesting to see that, which groups know about the request for funding proposals at the county and city level. In Oregon, we have an extremely high cost to incarcerate youth, and I, quickly pulled up Harvard, so we could easily be sending youth to Harvard for far less than the cost that it costs to incarcerate them. And I would guess in many instances we might even get much better outcomes. And so I just picked that up really quickly to show kind of invest-divest frames that we're also starting to move towards, of the fact that we're funding something, we have a limited pot of money. That means we're naturally not funding something else. These are choices we're making, and as taxpayers, mass incarceration is sustained on our dime. This is happening in our name, and until we start speaking up more about our budgetary dollars and some of the extreme cuts that have been going on with education, with housing, we need to be more vocal. Obviously, there's all sorts of things anyone can do. I would say, given the issues of the day, I would challenge us all to do just a little bit more. Whatever your passion is, find a way to also give back to these struggles, because again, I really feel like it'll take a movement to sustain real transformative change. So whether that's, just reaching to your pocket and donating to some of the activist groups on the ground, or voting, or running for office and entering a candidate training program, or showing up to a protest, or educating yourself and signing up for the Fair Punishment Project's daily digest and start staying aware of these issues, or, show up for jury duty. That's a huge piece of the puzzle. I mean, I once, a long time ago, am not proud to admit that I kind of weaseled my way out of it. And our justice system does not work when that happens. And so we all need to really step up. And obviously, schools and, things we can be doing with this money instead of continuing to throw more and more money towards systems of oppression and systems that are rooted more in evidence. And then finally, of course, speaking out, contacting your elected officials regularly, writing op-eds, but really joining together with other community members. I can't stress that enough, is that's the only way social progress has really ever come about, is when people not only get mad or outraged, but then they start getting organized, and that's part of that piece is coming together with other community members. And this issue really needs to start bubbling up, rising up, being put on the top of people's agendas. It's amazing when I meet with local elected officials, because we're trying to really do a bottom-up and down-up accountability. So I meet with some of the elected officials also, but just by flagging some of this, it moves it to the top of their agenda, and they end up, there's a saying of only things that get measured get done. And so if you can flag these issues for folks and start being part of the solution. So I'll just end by saying I really would love to hear your thoughts and your ideas at the end of this, again, if you're interested in sticking around. And with that, I hope tonight you'll go home and think more about what you can do where you live and hold power, because it really does take more people whose own families might not be impacted. I think we have to continue to center those who have been impacted by this the most, front and center of formerly incarcerated people and community members. But it's going to take a lot of people with privilege, people with power, people in boardrooms starting to care more about these issues, because there's a very huge human and fiscal cost to what we're continuing to do. And again, this is happening under our watch, so please plug in. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lillie Estes, Lillie A. Estes for listing purposes. Okay, thank everyone. The kind of work that I do in the community is just a different iteration of what Kate was saying. I am a community strategist. I've been doing community work as an adult, maybe 25, 28 years. I joined the NAACP as a youth in 1974, 75, and was able to be on their National Youth Work Committee and move into college in terms of how people in disaffected communities actually work to build power among themselves. Over the years of these 40 years, I'm 58 now, we've seen where different names and narratives have been describing just human behavior that we've been doing for many years. So what has been very pleasing to me is to see the confirmation of the work that's been started for several decades to actually be embodied. So at the present moment, I am actually a public housing resident, and I sought the office of mayor in the city where I live, which is Richmond, Virginia, which is the capital of the Confederacy, and we still have a lot of work to do. So what I'm also very passionate about is making sure that real results driven, and that people recognize that there are synonyms that we can use, because the human body only does several things repetitiously, and we can talk about it in different kinds of ways. So the empowerment of an individual that lives in an adversely impacted community is $65,000 question process, right? Because we are very fragmented, for structural racism, just privilege. And how do you really go in between all of that in order to empower an individual to really overcome when every day their challenges are multi-complex and multivariate? So we wanted to figure out a way that would build power among the community members who more times than not make the case against themselves. Whether it is a doctor with Medicaid fraud, or whether it is a drug dealer on the street, or self-medicating person, right? So those are kind of the different medical self-medicating financial ways and personal destructive ways that people tend to move in between that particular subject matter. So over the years, especially I ran across this young lady that wanted to do a documentary on Oliver Hill. And Oliver Hill was one of the lead attorneys that worked with the Brown v. Board of Topeka, Kansas. So as you all know, being here part of the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute, that he was the architect of the strategy for Brown v. Board. There were 5 jurisdictions that made up Brown v. Board, and they chose Topeka, Kansas because they didn't want to default to the southern states as a rationale for how to overcome that. The Virginia, Delaware, South Carolina, DC, and Topeka, Kansas. So in Linda Brown being able to be the child in Topeka, Kansas, they use actually the statistics of a boycott that was done in Prince Edward County in Virginia for the strategy. But as I said, the strategy being from Virginia, it was still mirrored in the Topeka, Kansas, because discrimination is discrimination is discrimination. So therefore we were able to look at how do we really impact the emotionality of people over time so where they can step into their power. So what I wanted to share, that over time I've come to a conclusion, and I wanted to map it in terms of how we look at what holds us in a behavior, whether it's the actual behavior or the mindset. So what I've come to know is arrested development, cognitive dissonance, and internalized racial oppression are real academic terms. And then the solution for human behavior for me translated arrested development into co-creating. The cognitive dissonance part is the mind part, so that translated for me into co-visioning. And then the internalized racial oppression, because I participated in a lot of different focus groups and city council meetings and school board meetings and all of that, and have been blessed to be able to have colleagues who I consider friends, who I've learned are not friends to me. And so that internalized racial oppression, the correction part of that would be community power, and recognizing that those elected officials are our employees. The challenge to that is that we as the we as the employer, our job descriptions, we don't all agree on what we want them to do. You know, so if I think I'm number one and you think you're number one, then we have to really decide who's number one. And then that actual behavior that they need to perform becomes a little muddled. So in developing that conversation, because the adversely impacted person or marginalized person really needs more motivation, repetitious motivation. And being a person that lives in public housing, I come across what I think are some themes that keep people in traction or move them into prosperity. And people being part of a community, so it's the community and the institutions as well. And also in the middle of that, we need to really recognize that outreach is not engagement. We tend to look at just going to talk to people as community engagement, but really it's not, because we don't know what's going to happen. And you have to be comfortable in your own person in order to be willing to sit in that awkward moment. You know, when you don't know what you're going to say, you don't know what the other person's going to say, but you have to get through it. You know, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, you have to get through it. And what happens over time, I've come to learn, is that the most positive way to engage people allows the best fruit to come forward. You know, so in doing that, that's an uphill lift, a heavy lift. And so when we're doing the heavy lift and doing the heavy lift and doing the heavy lift, you don't think you're making an impact, but really you are. And like draws like. And at that moment of critical mass, you will start beginning to see that you will have less heaviness and more fruit being born, so that when you go forward, the like drawing the like, and then you will learn that more positive things are happening in a faster period of time or more sustainable period of time. And then other people will join you, and the work that you thought that you had to do all by yourself, you will see people all around you happen to, you know, get in where they can fit in. And then that brings me to the slide here that's been up there for a minute. So in learning about the Charles Hamilton Houston strategy, you know, because we were in Richmond, because the court district there is named after Oliver Hill, and I started seeing all of these correlations, and I just had a real interest in doing community work and legal work, and the NAACP put me in touch with, you know, their historical legacy. So by default, you know, you're just going to learn that. And I'm going to tell you one other quick story. But Oliver Hill's partner was S.W. Tucker, and that was my mentor. My family nickname is Sam. So S.W. Tucker's name is Samuel. And he went by SW because he did not want to be referred to as Sam, because in that era of time, it may not have been looked at as nicely. But his father was a real estate agent, and he cleaned his buildings as a teenager. And in one of the tenets of his, you know, father's business was a lawyer. And Mr. Tucker would read the books in his law library, and he read for the bar for the state of Virginia and passed the bar and had to wait to his majority age before he was licensed and become a law partner with Mr. Hill. And that was like 36, 37, 38, somewhere in there. And then he enlisted in the United States Army and fought in whatever war there was around that time, World War I, World War II, I don't remember. But that is a very powerful, you know, patriotic person, you know, for his country. You know, he held the first sit-in 1939 and then enlisted and went in the Army. You know, so if you're interested, the story about that is called Out of Obscurity. It's on YouTube. And it talks about the first sit-in that was ever done in the United States, 1939, by S.W. Tucker and his brother, and some other attorneys. And he was co-counsel with Mr. Hill, with the other people in the Brown v. Board. So as we moved forward, you know, I got an email, I think, from Mr. Harris, David, sometime, telling me that, you know, we were exploring the term community justice, and that was a confirmation in my spirit for the work that I do in the community. And then over time, because of some of the things that were happening, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, a couple other things, we wanted to, you know, look at how do you really incentivize people who are adversely impacted, who make the case against themselves too many times, to really, believe in that Fifth Amendment, right? People use it all the time. We have the right to not incriminate ourselves. And even if you're a murderer, a drug dealer, or whatever, you have the right to put your weapons down and live an honorable life going forward. So how do you not be victimized, you know, and insecure? You know, and all of this stuff that I'm throwing out here now, it's certain iterations of my experience in the community is, you know, my come to Jesus moment with that. You know, I was sitting at a table with a police officer on the side. My significant other had a significant life on the periphery of the law, and I had to figure out how to have that conversation, you know, because we were talking about putting cameras up in the community where open air drug markets were, and it was just a hard conversation to have, you know, and me having a strong, you know, legal background with the NAACP, you know, just dropped in my spirit. I said, oh yeah, that's it, the Fifth Amendment. You know, you have a right to not incriminate yourself. Now we need to figure out how to utilize that language so that all members of the community can put that forward. You know, just because we are trying to eliminate crack houses in our community, eliminate dog fighting, eliminate prostitution, whatever the crime is, you know, and you have someone that may be in your family or a good friend that's doing that, you still have a right to not incriminate yourself if you turn and go into a righteous way of living. Spiritually, that is, I forgot. So anyway, so in the work that I'm doing, you know, as I said on the Eric Garner, we wanted to figure out, you know, how to really incentivize people, you know, where they stay engaged and move forward. And so a friend of mine came up with the fact, almost simultaneously, that we would do a community justice film series. And then we had it curated by this young lady with the Africana Independent Film Festival. And everything is really geared toward empowerment, self-help process. With the public housing piece of that, we're looking at how we use federal HUD policy that's always jacked up from the floor up. And it benefits a whole lot of people other than the people who live in public housing. So you have a resident management corporation initiative out of HUD that public housing residents can participate in. You have site-based Section 3, site-based Section 8. And then you have Section 3, and Section 3 is an employment opportunity. So being able to, you know, not be mad when you go in the room for participatory policy development, you know, is a repetitive, teachable moment, you know, that will go in a toolkit, you know, that we're going to begin to create. these are some of the partners here that perform different functions in the community, that do stellar work in the Richmond area, and some of them are national partners. The reciprocity part for me is in how do you really teach the community member, or if they have an epiphany of themselves and move into where the criminal justice system is. You know, public housing is inundated with repetitive, habitual, you know, not just the crime, but in my opinion, the lost opportunity for service providers to really pull the positive growth for community members forward. I really could say that a different way, right? But anyway, I won't. So the public housing group, which is this one here, RePHRAME with the interlocked arms, residents of public housing in Richmond against mass eviction. Many times, because of the stress of living in public housing, the service providers have challenges with how to get the effective growth, empowerment out of the public housing person and out of how they can be more effective in delivering their services. So you wind up with co-opted tenant councils, you know, and the elected official people will draw on that old leadership. And because it is the, what they say, duly recognized organization of the federal, then you have to go through them. But in working around that, we came up with this as a mechanism for supporting the awareness building of that. So that's a great opportunity to pair with some of the other partners that we have here, because it's really about closing gaps and transitioning into effective, transformative community building. So that's kind of the work that I do in terms of just real empowerment of basic, general citizens. And I say public housing and non-public housing, you know, because we have all kinds of other subject matters that go there. So in theory, you can click on one of those icons and it'll pull up their website. So feel free to go to that website. It's communityjusticefilmseries.com. And our love partner at the end is the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute. Our strong research partner is the Center for Global Policy Solution, also out of DC. And on that other side of that is the Inclusion Revolution, where if you're interested in how we have a declaration of accountability for regular citizens, then you would make sure that that happens. So thank you all very much.
Okay, so we're going to use the last little bit of time to get questions from the audience. And if folks don't have specific questions, I'll have backup questions. But I want to hear from community first. So does anybody have questions for any of the panelists? And I'll just run to you and pass along the mic. If you could just say your name and then the question.
Hi, I'm Grace Tatter. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Education, and I had a question specifically for Ms. Ayala, did I say that correctly?
Yes.
So I actually have a family member who's in a state prison facility in Florida, and so my family's gotten to know some people who have been through that system, and they've had pretty deplorable conditions and experiences. And I was wondering if you could talk about how your role can help engage our community members who are already in the prison system and how the state can work to make those conditions better.
So as the state attorney, one of the things that I'm always very well aware of and outspoken about is that I need other actors in the system who have power to do something. As a prosecutor, I have absolutely no control or oversight over Department of Corrections. But what I can do is to help educate people. And in Orange County, for example, the person who heads up our Orange County Jail, and they're appointed positions. So the Orange County Jail is appointed by the Orange County Mayor. So when people think that the mayor position is a very small position, that's the person who determines what's going on at the county jail. The warden at the Department of Corrections, those are also statewide appointments. So these aren't, people don't just land in those positions. It's usually selected by someone who we have elected. So educating people to understand that, appointing the right people, and if there are civil rights violations, to become very well aware of what those violations are and never take those for granted. Because if there are some conditions that are violating our 8th Amendment rights, then we need to make certain that you're following suit and following through.
My name is Bob Malbury. For all of you, I'm just wondering, in your work, do you find there's any relationship to what you do and the gerrymandering problem that is now going to be hitting the Supreme Court?
I'm particularly interested in the prison gerrymandering, especially related to communities of color who then become criminalized and then are shifted to state prisons, but they're counted for census population as being part of the rural areas, so they're actually enlarging districts of electeds who may not be in favor of criminal justice reform. So it's really complicated and problematic.
I can say, I'm elected by circuits, which is 2 counties, and some of them are multiple counties, but needing individuals to support the efforts that I'm making, it can determine whether or not I'm well represented, whether I'm not. So how the lines are drawn and who's elected definitely determines whether or not we can be more progressive in what we're trying to do.
Do other folks in the community have questions?
I would like to ask how you measure co-visioning and co-creating.
Good question. Well, I don't use like empirical data, but the goal is for the persons that are in the room to really participate, so that we're looking and searching for how the heart and mind can really just ferment. It's for me, it's a spirit thing, so that when, and I had mentioned to some, in addition earlier today, I was looking on Facebook a few days back ahead of one of our screenings that we were doing, and a young lady couldn't participate in that particular screening, but she was describing the event to another friend of hers, and I happened to witness her conversation on Facebook, and what she was trying to encourage the young lady to come to the event, and she described the Community Justice Film Series as an incubator for action. So what I'm looking at is when we're doing different things about enlarging our territory for participatory democracy, and then other people are engaged and they will coin a phrase that actually fits what we need to have happen. You know, we have a blog site on the web page, and the young lady gave us that name too. So where you look at some initiatives and it's only one person, I'm looking at how additional people can actually represent what the community becomes. So that's kind of it for me.
Hey, I'm Eddie. I'm a student at the Ed School. So I have a question for you. During your time at the podium, you kept using the word that you kept in reference to like Black and Latino young men in the urban space. You kept saying they have a right to do this or to do that, and the language felt very specific to me. That you kept saying they have that they have a right, and it also felt ironic. I was just wondering if you were using it for any specific reason.
Well, I'm a firm believer in using the language of the oppressor for your liberation. You know, so that, you know, we can't, I mean, we're here, you know, in this geography. So I understand that we need to, you know, change the narrative and things like that, but in order to get to that, we have to use the framework that we have until we can build what we need. So we have available to us the Fifth Amendment, which is the right to not incriminate yourself. And so when you're, and I don't mean to use it for nefarious reasons, but using it as a tool of empowerment so that people don't always make the case against themselves. You know, you just can't say, I mean, you know, in this, when Jesus died on the cross, that means I can keep sinning. You know, that's a reprobate mind. That's in that context. But in terms of just repeat habitual offending, you want to make sure that people are having larger options so they can make better choices. And so in being able to share that kind of information with people, it allows the mindset to change, it frees your spirit, and you're able to do things differently and more productively and more effectively is my thought. Thank you.
I'm going to do, I think, one more, maybe another question if we have a chance, but I think we're going to also end with a video, so I want to save a little time for that.
So first and foremost, I just want to say thank you all for coming here. I think all of you women are powerhouses, and the work that you're doing is definitely needed. Myself, as a young black man, I lead a movement called Stuck on Replay, and it's focused simply on a lot of what you all talked about, really elevating voices, uplifting community, and influencing policy around mass incarceration. And I just want to know, because all of you are women, and I want to know how many young men or men of color do you all have working with you, or supporting or mentoring, or because in this advocacy effort, it's very seldom that you see young men of color actively involved, and so I'm just curious, do you work with any young men of color, and if you do, tell me a little bit about it.
I'm very proud to say that my executive team is made up of women, gays, and blacks, including males. I believe in diversity. I believe that the same way that women and people of color have needed to be at the table, we have to have everyone at the table. Now, the dynamic and the issue that I have, Harold Bennett, he's my deputy chief, third in charge of my office. He's been a career prosecutor, someone I respect and I believe is a good trial lawyer and has a heart for the community. The problem that prosecutor offices have, generally speaking, is that they attract people who cannot usually sustain the amount of money that public service can allow. So we have to find ways to engage people and keep them well engaged despite the lack of payment. Because what happens, right? You look at two different demographics, and I'm speaking in general terms here, but you're looking at the demographic of men of color who are trying to build wealth, who are trying to build a family, who frequently are first, maybe second generation college students who cannot make $40,000 for the rest of their life. right? I mean, is that what you want to make and take care of your family? So it's very difficult when they don't have a family who can say, hey, it's Christmas, I'm buying you and your wife, here's your down payment for your home. You know, it's very difficult to say, here's the college fund for your children. And then you also have the ego that goes along with being a lawyer and being that people want the luxury. So we have to deal with the mentality in the community that makes this type of work attractive, as well as making you attractive for this. So it's a two-way street.
And for me, when I'm in an awkward position and not having a lot of African American men involved in the work that we're doing has been an awkward position for me for several years. But I can say within the last 3 years, we have slowly been acquiring the interest, I would say. And just as a spiritual transfer, when I was on the way to the airport to come here, one of my community babies I saw first thing in the morning, and we hugged, and he said, "You got this, Mom." You know, and then my natural born son is standing right back there, so we appreciate that. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, I too want to really recognize how important this question is. I work for a young man of color at my organization, but I think it's really important. There's two sayings amongst community organizers right now of mainly formerly incarcerated folks that are really bubbling up, which I think it's really important for people to internalize. And one of them is no more about us without us. And so, and the other one I think is really important is if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And so, you know, we struggle with the issue as an organization of always trying to include more voices of people most impacted. With this particular guide, our hope was really to put it out as a resource so that the community members on the ground, many of whom have been doing this work for a lot longer than I have, can use it in the way that it most suits their group and their organization. But yeah, I think your question is a really poignant one, and I hope more audiences and panels and boardrooms and groups considering these issues continue to think about who is included, who benefits, whose voice is being elevated.
If I can add too, I think it's important to note, I had shared this with David before, I'm an elected official. I happen to be married to an organizer. So we've got the dynamic in our home that our children are being raised with the one who's got boots on the ground and the one who's a decision maker. So I think it's I'm bragging and tooting my horn on that.
We're going to do one last question and finish up with a video from another community justice group.
I'm Tony Earls. I'm Professor Emeritus at the School of Public Health and Medical School. I'm trained in pediatrics, psychiatry, and public health, and I look at the world through the eyes of children. And I wonder what you think of. I was looking for instances, examples that you would give of children's participation. Didn't see many. I have a very hard time advancing the idea of the child as a citizen. And I wonder if you would comment just briefly on children's roles in democracy, justice, community justice.
So one of the programs that happens in my office, and I'm very happy that you asked about that, because if we don't have a pipeline, it ends with us. We are completely involved in the teen court. We actually have a day in the court where kids are now being more exposed to the prosecution aspect of it instead of just the defense work, understanding that they're part of the power structure as well. Anything related to kids being involved in the criminal justice system, I actually give my employees administrative leave to be involved in that, so that we have this pipeline along with some of the specialty schools and the programs. I think that's one of the most important things that we can do.
Yeah, I think that the point you raised is so important, because oftentimes children are not listened to, and they're not viewed as a resource. But I think there is in general with activism, if it is to move forward and be productive, I think intergenerational relationships is so key to that. And one place I saw it this summer was in Detroit at a water conference, and there was one of the panels was bringing up children themselves who had been so impacted by the issue to talk about their own involvement, and you could see how inspired they were by the work of their own parents. And I think right now as a college student, a lot of young people are missing that guidance from elders because they've been there before, they've been doing it forever, and there's so much to learn. So I think there definitely needs to be more intergenerational connection. That's a really important part.
So with this work, I've just started getting more engaged with the school to prison pipeline because it's an issue that's been coming up a lot. And so with that work, I've been really thinking more about my own parenting philosophy and how we punish as a society and how we're trying to encourage pro-social behavior and how we're modeling that. And so that has bled over to some of the work in local schools. I've been partnering with some community organizers to give trainings around mandatory minimums at local high schools. But in that work, we've been hearing directly from the students about the ways in which they've been targeted or caught up in the system, and for things that when I was a kid, if I had done the same thing, I would have been referred to like a counselor or a coach or a neighbor. These kids are getting referred to the cops. And so having this input from the kids has been really, really powerful, but I also recognize this is something that needs to be done more.
As one of our lead facilitators of our screenings actually do education advocacy for family members. So they have actually asked different families to participate in terms of how do they advocate on behalf of their own children. And then another one is a project of performance statistics. And I actually have some postcards here, so I'll give you one of those for that.
Thank you. So I want us to kind of hold our thoughts. I want to show a video. We closed the video. We opened with the video. I want to say that I'm going to show a video. We have one of the people highlighted in the video with us today, but I also want to say that this is a beginning and not an end, and we have actually a really nice video stuck on replay that's going to hit the website soon. And I thank you for coming, James, and for participating in that. I will also say, just on the gender, not the age, but the gender composition of the panel, I actually made a concerted effort to see if we could, in fact, not have a bunch of men and males up here. But I think the point, obviously, in terms of how we do our work is an important one, so I appreciate that. I do want us to appreciate the fact as well, though, that these are some pretty remarkable women. So Daniel, you're about to be on.
You know, I always say we recycle cans, paper, trash, but we don't recycle people. As a community, we're only as strong as the weakest. My name is Daniel Cordone. I was the founder of the Transitional Employment Program for Haley House, located in Boston. For me, it was about creating that benchmark of lowering the recidivism rate to almost eradicating it, and doing that through investing in people.
My name is Jerome Pitts. I was released from prison December 8, 2016, and I'm the TEP manager at Haley House. TEP is a transitional employment program geared for helping men and women who are re-entering society from incarceration. We have life skills, financial literacy, path of freedom, and it talks about that, what we all have in common, and some of the things that may be lacking because some men and women have been gone for as little as 2 to 3 years, up to 25. And a lot of the world has changed by then.
The tone of the conversation is slightly different than what you would find with most organizations. It wasn't, hey, we have services, we want to help you. We're not afraid to say that you owe. you owe, you owe. And that was the tenet of the program. You owe it to yourself for a chance to be successful. You owe it to your community. And no matter what happens, that you're not alone in this. We're not going to coddle you, we're not going to baby you, but we're willing to work with you and understand that there's a transition, hence transitional employment program. We underwrote the program through wholesale of cookies at local colleges and universities. And we said vocally that what we're doing here allows us the budget and the revenue to continue and provide the programming and the services that were made and designed for you. So there was ownership in that.
Haley House has an account with Boston College where every Monday we do from, I'd say, maybe 600 cookies all the way up to 1,000. We like to use that as a chance for men and women to discuss anything that they're going through. You know, there's a lot that happens when you're incarcerated. You know, you've hurt people, you've obviously hurt yourself, you miss family, family members miss you, and it can be hard to navigate once it's right there. And we encourage people to talk about that and learn to lean on each other and grow. No one's judging you about what you have done or the fact that, you know, you were incarcerated. It's all about what you can do now and what you want to do in the future. And they give you a chance to do that. By making people accountable, making people aware of their role in whatever the community creates, you know, whether good or bad. People in my community, black men and women, make up about 14% of the population in the United States. We make up over 70% of the prison population. And it's a passion for me to look at some of the men and women who have been incarcerated for whatever reason, you know, has turned that into a pillar of the community.
To have these stories become powerful, they become what's needed, I think, for change. The Transitional Employment Program, at its core, it is really about concern and care and presence. It's something that can be replicated anywhere. It just requires that investment, that time, the decision for a community to say that we're going to own everyone and that we're going to work and walk with everyone. None of the issues that we face today happened overnight. And none of them happened at the expense of one person or by the work of one person. And so the solution is the same. That it's going to take time and it's going to take effort of many. Well, I will steal something from the tenet of the program when I say we owe, we owe, we owe. And that doesn't just apply to people that are in the Transitional Employment Program. You know, that applies to everyone. That we have an obligation to one another, that we have an obligation to contribute of ourselves, and we have the obligation to be the best person that we can be in terms of really embodying what the true meaning of community is, the care, thought, and concern for one another.
Thank you, Dan. So I do want to close by thanking everybody for coming today, and I want to kind of emphasize that this is a beginning and not an end, and that the kind of conversation that we hope to have engendered here and the work that we've tried to show you. Look, Jasmine, and so a couple of things about these videos too. I want to make it clear that one was shot with an iPhone and one was shot by a videographer, but the fact is that we can all produce these, and we look forward to having people contribute these to our work. And as I said, we have one of stuff on replay, and we look forward to doing many more. So, Jasmine, come up here. I want us all to roundly thank our panelists for a really remarkable presentation. And with that, I think there's a little food left, and thank you all for coming.